Hello, welcome, uh, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar, The Destruction of Disaster Relief, the Trump Administration's Attack on Emergency Disaster Preparedness and Relief Aid. This is the latest iteration of the CAP series focusing on the human impacts of President Trump's DOGE cuts. My name is Doug Moloff. I'm a Director of Government Affairs here at the Center for American Progress, and I couldn't be more excited about the panel we have today to explore this life-saving work. Before I introduce our panelists, just a couple of housekeeping items. Live captioning is available using the closed captions tab at the bottom of your screen. We will also be taking questions at the end of the program. Please feel free to submit those questions using the questions tab on your screen. Well, without further ado, here with me today on our panel are Bobby Scopa, Riva Duncan, and Tom Sivak. Bobby is a retired firefighter, author, podcast host, and public speaker. She has 45 years of firefighting experience and has received numerous professional awards and industry recognition. She is the host of the podcast, Bobby on Fire. Riva is also a retired firefighter with over 30 years of wildland fire and forestry experience. She is a consultant for the U.S. Forest Service international programs, currently working with firefighters in Ukraine, the Republic of Georgia, and North Macedonia. Tom is an experienced leader in large-scale emergency management, disaster planning, preparation, response, and recovery. He is a former FEMA Region 5 administrator, which coordinates FEMA assistance before, during, and after disasters happen throughout 6 states and 36 federally recognized tribal nations. He now works in the AI and emergency management sector. So thank you to our 3 panelists for taking the time to discuss this really important matter with all of us today. It has certainly been a tough year for federal employees, including those involved in disaster response. It began, of course, with a fork in the road email and has continued with the ongoing reduction in force efforts. FEMA in particular has been singled out by President Trump and Homeland Security Secretary Noem for possible elimination. Reports indicate that as many as 20% of permanent staff at FEMA have been laid off or left the agency, including some key leaders. In fact, the administration's original acting FEMA administrator, Cameron Hamilton, was removed from the job just 1 day after he testified at a congressional hearing that he does not think, quote, it is in the best interests of the American people to eliminate, close quote, FEMA. This is all happening as we are now in hurricane season, and wildfire season is also underway. Just in the last week, we've seen serious flooding in West Virginia and Texas, tornado and severe storm outbreaks in the Midwest. CAP's Extreme Weather Series page highlights how climate change is fueling this extreme weather that we have experienced in recent years and continue to experience. The cuts to FEMA have also happened on the other side of the disaster circle, which is weather forecasting. Earlier this year, as a part of this DOGE Cuts series, we explored the cuts to NOAA and the National Weather Service, which is still available on the CAP website. With that, I think we should go to our panel. And Tom, I wanted to start with you. Could you walk us through the work of disaster response? How does FEMA fit into the overall disaster response?
Absolutely, Doug, and thank you so much for having us today. The disaster response cycle starts local and ends local. One of the things that we looked at is that when these local incidents happen, local communities, depending on the size and complexity of that incident, may exceed their ability to respond. That's when mutual aid comes into play from jurisdictions surrounding that community. From that point, depending on the size and complexity of the incident, a state or a territory may have full engagement on their end to be able to provide immediate response and immediate recovery services. And depending on the size and complexity, if it exceeds the ability for the state or the territory to be respond to it, or the tribal nation, they then would reach out to FEMA and indicate that they have exceeded their capacity and capability to respond to that particular incident. Now, when we look at the disaster cycle, one of the things I can say is that at the local level, these responders are in the fight from the moment that incident takes place until that long-term recovery process, which may last years, ends. And so one of the things that we look at in this disaster cycle is that a local person may be a one-person shop. Then they need their mutual aid assistance, which brings other agencies together. But they all have to get back to their regular day-to-day business as well, while those other communities are recovering. So in the end of the day, when we see where FEMA fits in, it's when they exceed their capacity and capability to respond. FEMA is a support agency. They have the ability to respond with the federal family, as they indicated, or federal agencies, to be able to support the states and the locals to be able to get onto the road as quickly as possible. One of the things I can say is that for FEMA, specifically for resources, what does FEMA bring to the table? They bring subject matter expertise. They bring the entire federal government in terms of resources to the table. They bring statutory authority, and they also bring resources, aka money, to the table to help onto the recovery. Those communities have to meet the exceeding their ability to respond, but at the same time, what FEMA brings to the table is a lot more resources than locals and state government would have as well.
Thanks, Tom. So the exceeding the ability to respond brings FEMA to the table. Can you talk about how the loss of people that we've already seen at FEMA, up to as much as 20% of permanent staff, how that has already impacted the ability of the agency to prepare for and respond to disasters?
Absolutely. There is a robust mutual aid process already in place through the states to be able to support each other. However, if you look at the loss of the people at FEMA who would come in to support at the state level, that loss of 20% is already impacting those jurisdictions today. I'll give you an example. A state that's exceeded the capacity to be able to respond to an incident then creates a joint field office where FEMA personnel come from all across the country to be able to respond to the needs of those communities, usually in the recovery period. Sometimes has between 100 to 200 people within that joint field office on a regular basis. States will put their personnel alongside with them, but states don't have the capacity either. So when you look at that loss of staff, one of the issues we have is that we're never going to get it back. We've lost a lot of the agency already, with 20% loss of personnel across the agency, on top of the loss of key leaders throughout the agency who have hundreds of years of experience combined. Losing that means that we've lost the history, we've lost the reason why laws were enacted, we've lost just understanding how the last disasters took place. And while each disaster is different, when you lose that, getting back to what took place in the past is going to be more difficult. And it's going to then put more stresses and pains on the staff that are still there, who are some of the most dedicated personnel in the federal government, to be able to focus on getting those communities back on the road to recovery. And we also have to look at this. We are in a perpetual state of response. We've seen catastrophic wildfires take place. We've seen flooding events even in this last week. We see other non-traditional incidents that are happening at the local level while communities are trying to recover. So one of the things that we have to look at is, how do we respond to this challenge that's being faced with these funding cuts and the loss of staff? But additionally, what about the next catastrophic incident that were to take place? If you look back at Hurricane Helen, where there were hundreds of counties that were affected across the Southeast, There were thousands of FEMA employees that stopped their day jobs to go focus on getting those communities back on the road to recovery. That's the nimbleness of FEMA. There's not many other federal agencies that have that ability to be able to respond to the immediate needs of a community, and then to be able to get them on the road to recovery as well.
Well, on that note, you mentioned, Tom, some of the other agencies that FEMA partners with as part of a response, and I wanted to turn to Bobby to talk through how the U.S. Forest Service, in particular, works with FEMA and as part of an overall disaster response.
Thanks, Doug. Forest Service is one of dozens and dozens of federal agencies who have a role in disaster response as a part of the National Response Framework. That was established in 2008, and it identifies all the different agencies that have a role when there's a declared federal emergency. There's what we call emergency support functions, and the Forest Service is the lead agency for firefighting. So if there's any kind of need for firefighters or firefighting, the Forest Service is the lead agency that coordinates that. Well, when there's a federally declared disaster, there's going to be a need for power, there's going to be a need for communications, there's going to be a need for engineering kind of work. Well, all the different agencies from the federal government have a role, and everybody responds just like it's a fire, I'll say, and where you'd see fire engines. Well, it's the same thing. It's a national declared emergency, and every federal agency has a role in either as a lead or in support. And so the Forest Service has responded to floods and fires and hurricanes and 9/11. We were at 9/11 at the Pile in New York. So the Forest Service has a lot of resources. Not only do we have 11,000 firefighters, we have also a cache of supplies and personnel with expertise. So the Forest Service has responded to hundreds of different declared emergencies, and Reva and I both have been a part of those. So Forest Service is integral to the response, but there's more that the Forest Service is involved in. As Tom was describing the overwhelming of an agency, a local agency, and they go to mutual aid, and the mutual aid gets overwhelmed, you go to the state. When the state gets overwhelmed, not only do they, when they ask for assistance from FEMA, the Forest Service is the agency. If it's a fire, if it's a wildland fire, the state may be applying for a federal an FMAG, a Fire Management Assistance Grant. And the U.S. Forest Service is integral in determining and making an evaluation of whether this fire is, particularly a fire, is going to get big and whether it really meets criteria. And so when I was still working, me and my staff would be those folks providing FEMA with some expertise about what this fire is looking like, where is it going. So the Forest Service as a federal agency, like most federal agencies, are integral to disaster response.
Thanks for that overview. Can you speak a little to what it would mean for states as well as federal firefighters within the Forest Service to have a more limited version of FEMA, the likes that we're already seeing with the existing personnel cuts?
Sure. Well, as Tom mentioned, and as everyone listening can understand, fewer people means less capacity. And not only that, but there's grants that local fire departments get that get funneled through FEMA, they get funneled through the Forest Service, they get funneled through the Bureau of Land Management. Those small agencies, those volunteer fire departments, those small fire departments, they're dependent on that grant money for personnel and equipment. So it's not just fewer firefighters, less of them available to respond. It's also less money for the local agencies. And we're not talking about departments like, Phoenix Fire, New York Fire Department, Oklahoma City. We're talking about small departments, small organizations that are having bake sales to raise money for equipment. As all of our agencies become stressed, that money is going away, and those smaller agencies are going to be they're going to be hurting. They're already feeling it, and so the Forest Service is going to have fewer people to respond to assist. Because keep in mind, everybody might not understand this, but when there's an emergency and if the Forest Service is responding, it's not just the firefighters who are responding. It's all of those people who are not firefighters, the finance people, the business people, the people who we depend on for putting our contracts together. Those folks are integral to the response when there is a large federal emergency, a declared disaster. So you might hear that there's the same number of firefighters, but I can tell you that that we are going to be hurting because we have a loss of personnel in all of those other positions that support emergency response.
Thanks for that, Bobby. On the grant side, safer grants and other grants that support equipment. I know when I was working for a member of Congress, getting those requests from locals, but locals also had to know what they wanted or needed to request from a capacity side. Riva, I wanted to bring you in here and wanted to know, if you wanted to add any thoughts on the question I asked Bobby about more limited resources and how that impacts the ability to do the job.
Yeah, so thanks for having me. Even though I've been retired for 4 years, I still go out as an emergency hire with the U.S. Forest Service. And I literally just got back yesterday from the Southwest, who is in the peak of their wildland fire season right now. And we're already feeling some stress in the system with being able to support firefighters and fire personnel responding. There are 2 very large problematic fires in New Mexico right now with mandatory evacuations. And the Forest Service is working very closely with state of New Mexico and then with these local fire departments that we've all been talking about. Tom made the great point that disasters start locally, right? And then they finish locally. And so what we were talking about, a fire management assistance grant, if the state of New Mexico is going to file for an FMAG with FEMA, but there's nobody to process that, there's nobody to get that going. There's nobody to work with them on it, or even on the Forest Service side as a principal advisor, I've done that job as well. Then that delays that funding that goes back to the states to reimburse this, right? And so we're looking at deficit budgets. We're looking at, pretty serious consequences because then what do they do for the next fire? And so, this is all integrated. It's all, it's like this web where we support each other, we rely on each other, and we're all a little concerned about what the rest of the wildland fire season looks like.
Well, I didn't, coming back from an emergency deployment, during that deployment, was it different than your previous? Were there anything you noticed different in this one versus previous?
Well, I was in southern New Mexico in May, which is an extreme drought. And we had a few small fires. We were able to catch most of them at a pretty small size. But we were struggling to get purchasers to reimburse the firefighters for basic supplies like water and batteries and oil for their chainsaws, because other than emergency responders, the purchase card authority has been taken away from a lot of the other non-fire people. And like Bobby said, there's this whole network of people behind the scenes of the actual boots on the ground that support those folks in doing the work they're doing. And that's where we've seen a lot of the losses in these employees. And so we started seeing a little bit of that. It was a little bit slower in northern New Mexico, where I just came back from, but we're all on edge about what this looks like in August, which will be the peak western fire season. Montana's starting to have fires now. Oregon, eastern Oregon is now just having fires. Idaho, Washington. So the fire season is ramping up, and it's concerning. It's concerning for a lot of us to think our firefighters aren't going to get the support they need. And what that means is, if we can't support a group of firefighters in the backcountry, we have to pull them out, right? And so that means we may not be able to respond to fires. We may start, but then have to withdraw. And that has huge consequences for communities, businesses, for citizens, both just in looking at damage, but also lives.
That point about, if you can't support the folks in the field, you have to pull them out, which means no one responds, is a point I think really needs to be underlined. If it takes too long to get a purchase approved in Washington or at the regional office, that can have big consequences. One thing I wanted to touch on, Riva, I mentioned the previous Doge event series we had on the cuts to NOAA and the National Weather Service. How important is the weather forecasting to the work that you and others do in responding to these disasters?
Well, it's huge. The U.S. Forest Service and the other land management agencies employ a very small number of trained meteorologists, and they're called predictive services. So they're not looking just at tomorrow's weather, but they're looking in a month or two, right, and seeing what fire season might look like. But we rely heavily on the National Weather Service offices. They do actual fire weather forecasting. They do it twice a day. They're the ones who say we're in a red flag warning or a fire weather watch, that a lot of members of the public then, that catches their attention, right? Firefighters then need to know what to expect for the day. They may have to change their strategy and tactics, right? And so it's really critical. When I was in southern New Mexico in May, we had a weird weather event and it was not forecasted. And the local forecasting office called us direct. The meteorologist called direct to give us a heads up. Hey, you've got dry lightning coming in. Right. And so that relationship is huge. And it's again, it helps us with strategy and tactics, but we also relate it to safety. We've had weather events that have killed firefighters, and that we all know that we've had fires driven by winds and other weather events that have, taken out whole communities. And so we're a little worried about that, because we also work night shifts on fires. And I know some weather forecasting offices for the first time ever are not going to be able to do 24-hour shifts. And so that is, again, another thing that's concerning, and another example of how everything's interrelated. And if you impact one agency, it can have just snowball effect to other agencies and to the public.
Well, thanks, Riva. This next question I wanted to open to the entire panel, but start with Tom. What would it mean for disaster response in the U.S. For FEMA to be eliminated, as the White House has talked about, and to centralize that form of decision making in the White House?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Doug. The first thing I have to think about is this. Disasters have no boundaries. There is no partisanship in disasters. They affect everyone across our nation. And when you take an agency that has over 45 years of experience and growth and has watched these disasters unfold and has built capacity and capability in communities, eliminating that agency is going to have catastrophic effects at the most local level. It potentially could impact states, as the current administration is saying that more onus should be on states and locals. But the elimination of the subject matter experts at the highest level of government to help drive policy, to help understand how each of these disasters are impacting these communities, and making sure that there's funding available to help those communities get back on the road to recovery, it's going to be catastrophic. We don't know what that looks like right now, but the elimination of a federal agency even if it were to be consumed into another federal agency, means that we will be taking that focus of disaster consequence management, crisis management, emergency management, and built resilience out of what that focus was, where FEMA's has put a lot of time and attention, especially over the disasters in the last 25 years. Once that goes away, how are we going to get it back? How do we then bring it back from all these agencies to focus on it? Our disasters are getting worse. We are seeing communities that are decimated time and time again. Kentucky is a prime example. The Commonwealth of Kentucky is a center point now of disaster after disaster after disaster, whether it's a tornado event, whether it's a flash flooding event. These communities can't get back on the road to recovery fast enough. And just as they're on the road to recovery, they get hit again by another disaster. We look at the catastrophic wildfires that are taking place throughout, and how do we get these catastrophics? How do we make sure that these communities can respond to that event, but also recover from it? And then you look at the long-term recovery of what's taking place. Hurricane Helene recovery is going to take decades to come back. When we look at the catastrophic events of what took place down in the Southeast last year, how are those communities going to get back on the road to recovery and be more resilient for the next disaster that's about to come at them? Those are all challenging events. And what I want to get to is this. If the White House is making the decisions, it just turned that fine line of disaster, the mission of helping people, and made it political. And disaster shouldn't be the political. We should be focused on the survivors, the communities that have been impacted. That should be the number one thing that we should be focusing on, regardless of the side of the aisle that anybody's on. In the elimination of an agency, we don't know what those catastrophic effects are going to be. And the goal is to make sure that we don't, and to make sure that we continue to focus on helping people before, during, and after disasters.
Thanks, Tom. I would just note there were $27 billion extreme weather events in 2024. So when you talk about not just Helene, but other major disasters and the long road to recovery those communities face. Bobby, same question to you.
Well, I would say that there's two parts of this in my mind that I think about. I think about communities actually being destroyed and lives lost due to this. You've got the actual physical aspect of this when there's lack of response. When there is a big event, a disaster that happens oftentimes, say it's a hurricane or building collapse or whatever. Fire departments from around the country have FEMA-sponsored urban search and rescue teams. And those folks are funded by FEMA. And in a moment's notice, you can have hundreds of thousands of dollars of equipment, millions of dollars worth of equipment and personnel, trained urban search and rescue people with the dogs who can go in with the equipment and go into a building collapse. Now, that's because of FEMA and FEMA's funding. Those folks are out there, they're funded. Now, so that's the physical aspect of this. On the other side, you've got the financial side. Towns, cities, and states are going to go broke. Who's going to reimburse them for all these expenses? If a small fire department needs to fly an air tanker, those air tankers are not cheap. If fire chiefs start worrying about, well, I don't think I can afford to pay for this air tanker. That's the way it used to be. If they have to start worrying about who's going to pay for that air tanker to come in, they might not order it because they can't afford it. And if they don't order it, houses will be lost, lives can be lost, including firefighters. If they do order it and they don't have the money, what happens to a small town? We're talking about little fire departments. This is not necessarily just big cities, but including the big cities. I mean, places like the LA, the Southern California fires, those fires cost so much money, hundreds of millions of dollars. Where does that come from? And we think, oh, Southern California's got a lot of money. Well, what about the small towns out in the hills? that are volunteer fire departments, small communities, they are going to need assistance. So I think we're going to have the potential to lose lives, property, and towns and small governments going broke.
Thanks, Bobby. Anything to add, Riva, from your perspective?
Well, I'll just say that I actually live in Asheville, North Carolina, and so I was impacted personally by Hurricane Helene, and of course my entire community in the whole Western North Carolina, Eastern Tennessee. And it's been back and forth between our state and FEMA, and the administration, I should say, about support for FEMA. President Trump showed up right after he became into office, promising assistance, and he's gone back on that promise, which a lot of us were not surprised about. And North Carolina, the state, cannot afford to hold the bag, like we've been saying. It's illegal to go deficit in any kind of government budget at any level. And so, people are scrambling and trying to determine what we're going to do. As Tom said, it's going to take years for this area to recover from this. And, I put my firefighter hat on, and we've got 800,000 acres of downed timber from the hurricane, much of that on state and federal lands. And we are very nervous about upcoming fire season. Our fire season here is spring and fall. We already had some fires in the hurricane blowdown. And while the logs weren't really dried out yet, that wasn't as much of a concern. Accessibility was. They couldn't get to these fires. They couldn't put people on these fires. And so that's going to actually get worse before it gets better. And so, again, it's very frustrating because even when we talk about, we have firefighters in the Forest Service. Well, we're advising and directing and working with the local county sheriffs on where to put evacuation centers, right? And then FEMA comes in and works with nonprofits and those governments to then help support those evacuation centers and receiving and distribution and water. Critical things like that I think we all take for granted, but FEMA plays a huge role in that. So it's concerning on many levels.
Thanks for that, Riva. One thing Bobby mentioned in the example about calling a tanker in is FEMA was established in the 1970s, and the world before FEMA, where people hesitated. Tom, I wanted to go to you to kind of elaborate on that. Cities and states and disaster declarations, they're saying that their existing abilities are being exceeded, correct? So the cost shift to those states and localities seems to be putting them in an impossible situation with other local priorities bearing the cost to make up for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's just take for an example. So the onus is now being placed on state and local communities and tribal nations. And as the onus gets put on all of these entities, one of the things that I think about is that there is not a disaster relief fund that may exist. Many states, some states do have disaster relief funds. Some states do not. They might have a rainy day fund, which has money allocated for anything that could take place, not just specifically to a disaster. Then when you look at local communities do not have disaster relief funds. I know of, out of my entire region in my tenure, I knew of one local community that was just starting to create a local disaster relief fund. So when you start looking at the elimination and cutting, these local communities, states, tribal nations may not necessarily have those resources to be able to respond and get that community back on the road to recovery. Let's also look at the fact about capacity and capability. When you look at emergency management across the nation, many of these places are one-person shops. They're also a local volunteer fire chief. They're also a 911 director. They might be the risk manager for the county at the same time. And when you look at these communities that are impacted, how do we focus on getting a community back on the road to recovery when there's someone that's wearing 4 different hats? And then we look at the cutting of grants that help build on that capacity and capability. And that loss I've already heard of agencies across the nation that are having to do a reduction in their force, which they were already thin to begin with. And then you take these subject matter experts away from this very important role. Yes, there's a lot of blue sky days in emergency management, but today there's a lot of gray sky days. And it's more of every single day there's another disaster. There's another incident that's taking place that's impacting. So when we look at the elimination of this, what it does is it sets us up for failure. And that's one of the challenges that we have to be thinking through is what does this look like? We understand that even if you look back in the previous administration, we were in a perpetual state of response for 4 years. We knew that we were going to have to put more focus on it because we couldn't stop responding to these incidents. And so when you start thinking about it, this is a major problem that is going to have cascading impacts across the nation. And we haven't even talked about how all of these resilience projects have all been canceled. This is to stop communities from having these disaster after disaster after disaster. And the loss of all these resilience projects, that's going to have catastrophic impacts. So as far forward as we've come, we're kicking ourselves back. Who knows how long? And the challenge that we're going to face is that some communities are going to be lost. We know that sea level rise is a thing. We know that there's communities that have to have managed retreat because they're flooding at a record rate. And so when we look at where we are today, the loss of all of that is going to have catastrophic impacts that we cannot predict. What we can say is this: disasters are happening on a regular basis. I would believe that we all can see that that's taking place. While someone might call it a fluctuating weather pattern, which is the new term I heard today, I would say that our climate is telling us that we're at a very crucial point, that we need to be focusing and doubling down on making sure communities are prepared, making sure that communities can figure out how to build that resilience, but most importantly, making sure that they can rely on resources, capacity, and capability before these disasters happen. So when they're in the fight, just as Reva was talking about being in Nashville, it's anticipated that there were promises and promises weren't met, which meant that there's now eroded trust in government when there was really challenging trust in government to begin with. And now we have to rebuild that from scratch. And I always say, the most powerful thing we can do is show up, and actions speak louder than words. And right now, that's going to be challenged as we face what potentially could come of it.
Thanks, Tom. I'm really glad you touched on the resilience and the preparedness part of the equation. And Bobby, I want to turn to you. We've talked about a lot of different cuts to a lot of different parts of the disaster ecosystem, for lack of a better word. And so I just wanted to see, in your opinion, what cut or proposed cut concerns you most.
Well, it's hard to pick one thing and say this is the most concerning for me. I guess having spent most of my career working in smaller communities and responding, as a fire operations person into the backcountry, small towns, small communities, I'm most concerned about the impact it's going to have on those little communities. Like I said, I spent my career in those small communities, and these are hardworking people who, many of them, like Tom mentioned, are volunteers or they're doing multiple jobs. I have responded so many times to a community who is so overwhelmed, and they look to us like we're the cavalry coming in to save them. And it breaks my heart to think that they are not going to have a robust response. I mean, we're barely hanging on to the response that we can put together now. In the last 10, 15 years, we have been so overwhelmed. We have been unable to respond really to the degree that has been the need. And so imagine that we start reducing the ability to respond to the degree that we even have been, which hasn't been enough. And now we're going to be cut back in terms of numbers of people and the money to help them recover, the money to help them respond. That fire chief who doesn't know whether he should order an air tanker or not because he doesn't know if he can afford it. God forbid, we're going to be losing communities. And these small communities are not, most of them aren't really robust financially to begin with. And then imagine that we lay on top of this some more financial burdens. I think I'm most concerned about the small towns out there, and this is going to be a cumulative effect on them. So we start impacting on their grants, we start impacting on the ability to reimburse them for costs, we reduce the amount of response that we have available for them to get from the federal government. It's all going to be really bad, Doug.
Thanks. Riva, on a forward-looking basis, we heard that concern, I think you mentioned it about August and what August would look like in peak. And so, I wanted to get your sense of, given where we are now, what if you could spell out a bit more why August concerns you so much?
Well, we in the wildland firefighting culture, we call it Dirty August, because it does seem to be kind of a convergence when most of the western geographic areas are having the most of their fires. It's hot. We're seeing a lot of storms come through with dry lightning. Even if we're not in a long-term drought, seasonal droughts are very common that time of year. And so it stretches the system when the system was already, when the system is okay, it still stretches the system. But like Bobby mentioned, the system was already overburdened. It's going to test and stretch the system. And that usually is in August into September. And so, because what happens when multiple geographic areas are experiencing large wildland fires is, everybody goes to those fires, and then we literally run out of resources. We tap into everything that we have. And so then there's a lot of triage going on. There are strategies, there are decisions made about where we send the air tanker if 5 fires need it, but we don't have 5 air tankers available. What are the values at risk? So there are a lot of people making these very strategic decisions, and it will stretch, and I am worried that it will break the system. And what I'm most concerned about is that the responders on the ground, the wildland firefighters, they're the ones that are going to bear the burden of decisions that they did not make. And I worry about the risk to them. I worry about their safety, because this is a really cool group of people who don't like to say no, who don't like to say we can't do this. And I believe they're going to try to take on the burden again, and put themselves in harm's way, put themselves in danger more than the job already is a dangerous job, because they're parts of these communities and because they are true public servants who value what they do and what they do for the American taxpayer. So that's keeping me awake at night. I will be honest with you, Doug.
Well, I think certainly the human lives of those public servants who put themselves in those situations is always in certainly my mind. And I think on that point, it's a good segue to our audience Q&A. And thank you to those who did submit questions through the Q&A function. The first question we have is from Zachary Turner, reporter with WFAE News in Charlotte, North Carolina. The question is, FEMA relies heavily on contract inspectors to evaluate properties after a disaster. These inspectors often underestimate the damage to structures, leading to many denied applications or smaller payouts for disaster survivors. Without FEMA, or with a reduced FEMA, how would states likely handle post-disaster inspections, and would that likely increase contractor participation?
Yeah, I can take that one. So thanks, Zach, for that question. When you look at this, one of the things that I found in individual assistance specifically, especially in inspections, it's verified losses, right? So if we have a baseline verified losses, if FEMA were to go away or they put the onus on the states, that means that disaster is now going to be more expensive on the state level to be responsible for those contracting costs potentially. Be honest with you, in the end of the day, the question I have back to many of to states are they ready? That if FEMA were to go away, are they ready to take on that extra layer of contracting and bringing the inspectors in? Are they ready to pay for them? Is the state ready to bear potentially higher costs? The cost share used to be 75-25. Sometimes catastrophics, could have been 90-10 in terms of the cost of the disaster. But if that onus goes back to the states, that's going to eat into the state's ability in the state's budget that they don't have planned for potentially. And so we have to be thinking now, what is that going to look like? What I've said to anyone that's within the field that's dealing with the unknown right now is treat this like an incident. Anticipate all of these small, minute details that are actually very important, especially for the survivor. That has to be a consideration right now. If states are looking at it, they should be thinking about if contracting costs for home inspectors have to come onto the state, what does that look like? What state agency might take that on that role and that responsibility? Do they even have a contract in place? Can they try to get those contracts going right now so that those costs are a little bit less? Of course, no one knows what that is going to look like. We have heard the administration say that they're going to wait until after hurricane season, which may mean that there's some bought time. But at the same time, I would also say we have to be ready for the consequences if the administration or, however which way the administration sees that they're going to do with FEMA. States are going to have to be planning for what that looks like for them to be able to respond to the needs of the communities.
Bobby, Riva, I see you nodding. If one of you wants to jump in and add, please do so.
I'll jump in quick. My FEMA inspector came from the state of Maine. He was retired military, who then does contract for FEMA. And he'd been working 12, 14-hour days, hadn't had a day off in 3 weeks, and was really working his tail off. And I also think, like what Tom said, not just about pay, but FEMA has the system set up with all these people in it to then order them. So the states are going to have to invent a system and find these inspectors that cost time and money, right? So it's not just the money of paying for the inspector, but how do you get them into the system that is now a state system, individual state systems, 50 state systems instead of one federal system.
Mm-hmm.
Doug, I don't have anything to add on that. I'm just, it's just a frightening scenario to me.
It certainly is. With that, we'll go to our next question from Leah Douglas with Reuters. Leah asks, can the panelists speak more to how specific restrictions like purchase card limits or DHS review of allocations over $100,000 have affected field deployments in recent weeks?
Yeah, Leah, I just heard this myself today, to be honest. So I have not heard of the impacts right now, but I feel that what ends up happening is this. If everything has to be reviewed, that's over $100,000, which you probably look at, what Bobby was talking about in terms of an air tanker. Multiple air tankers requested at a certain price is going to be well over $100,000. And so if the secretary would have to approve anything over $100,000, there's going to be a bottleneck, and that's going to have impacts on communities. FEMA has a very large ability to contract with multiple entities at any given time and then work with federal agencies. But disasters cost money, and recovery of communities cost money. And whether it's blue sky day allocations in terms of grant funding or disaster relief fund allocations in terms of the disaster relief fund, all of that, if it has to be approved by one particular individual, is going to have cascading effects overall. And so we have to have our ear to the ground right now with these communities that are impacted. I was just looking at the potential for severe weather risks in the middle of the country today. I mean, we are literally every day there's another disaster that's happening. I just saw the Fire Management Assistance Grant was approved in New Mexico as a prime example. But we're just seeing the start of what severe weather season takes place. But I'll also say this, disasters are now year round. So this is just going to continue to evolve over time. We also have to remember this. Right now, there are 9 disasters that are waiting. There's 9 states, nine entities that are waiting to hear whether they're going to receive a major disaster declaration. That means that those communities are waiting to get on that road to recovery. That's a challenge, and that basically impacts the most local level of people we serve.
Reva, anything to add?
Yeah, within the Forest Service, when it comes to wildland fire and the other incidents we respond to, we have what are called buying teams. And so when we have a large fire and an incident management team is mobilized, typically a buying team is ordered, and they then take care of a lot of the purchasing to support the firefighters on the ground, but then to pay for large contracts, right? Heavy equipment, caterers, things like that. And so we have, some of them are called warranted purchasers. So they have that higher level of purchasing authority, like the $100,000 level. It doesn't have to be approved by DHS, but within the Forest Service, they have that approval authority already. Well, these are a lot of the people that have been forced out by the administration, either through the probationary firings, the voluntary separations, the early buyouts. And so we were just having this discussion in New Mexico. There are hardly any buying teams left. And so there are other acquisition teams now that they're going to have to use who aren't as familiar with the system, and it's fewer people. And so then we wait. It takes longer, right? So those are just some of the implications that I've seen myself.
Thank you, Reva. An audience question. Can you speak a little bit as to why FEMA, as opposed to some other agency or potential agency, is best suited to prepare for and provide relief during disasters?
Thanks for that. What I will say is this, emergency management is a field and a profession that continues to grow. I've been in this profession for 20 years. One of the things I can say is that emergency management, regardless of the level, understands the plan. They understand more of the community. They know who does what, when, and where in terms of the agencies that they work with. When you look at FEMA, one of the things I'll say is this. While I was there, I learned that we had 108 federal agencies that we could tap into to be able to solve a problem. We knew if there was an incident, a catastrophic incident, what we were doing at FEMA is we were able to call the agencies to the table to solve a problem, to focus on lives and to focus on property. Okay. So when you look at that, if you were to decentralize emergency management or consequence management out of an agency that were basically built on subject matter experts that knew how to get a hold of the subject matter experts, this United States Forest Service and FEMA were fantastic partners. Why? Because we knew exactly what the Forest Service could bring to the table at any given time. If you lose that, what you're losing is you're losing that ability to coordinate. We have to have someone that's at the front, the tip of the spear, coordinating an incident. Otherwise, it's going to be caught in bureaucracy. It's going to get there. We know that it's going to be political to begin with, but then at the same time, we also know how to navigate between the federal community, the state governors, tribal nations, territories, local communities. As a regional administrator, I understood that my role and responsibility was to weave in and out of every single one of them to focus on what mattered most, which was people. And that was one of the biggest challenges we are going to see is that if you eliminate it and put response in another agency, there's going to be mission assignments that are going to have to be made. How fast can they get out the door? I saw it myself. I was told to put staff on the ground within 12 hours. I was directed to put staff on the ground in 12 hours. I did it in 10. Why? Because I had a dedicated staff that was focused on the most important thing, which was getting out the door to be able to help the states and the communities that were impacted. Getting other federal agencies that aren't geared that way, we know the Forest Service is, they're ready to go at a moment's notice. But if you look at other federal agencies, not every single one of them were set to be able to get out the door within 24 hours of an incident. And so when you look at it, you had a team of subject matter experts that knew policies and procedures. Now, decentralizing it will have longer effects that the states are going to be on the front lines for. And we have to remember, by the time FEMA got there, they're already tired. They've been up for 48, 72, maybe 96 hours. They've been in the fight. They have this one person that understands understands what they can bring to the table. They're a key person that is part of a team that can help. But loss of that and decentralizing that is going to have effects.
Bobby, I see you nodding.
Well, just briefly, if you said not FEMA, then who? We will, if that were to happen, all we would be doing is reinventing the wheel. We've got a system. FEMA is the framework. They're not, like Tom has said, they're not necessarily the army that's showing up. They're the coordinators. If it's not FEMA, it'll be another agency. Okay, so then another agency is going to have to reinvent the processes and all of the ways of doing business, and it'll be like the ultimate in inefficiency. And if it gets decentralized, then it's not going to get done.
Well, not getting done, and disaster response means people get hurt and property is damaged that wouldn't otherwise be. On that note, given we are nearly at time, I wanted to know, Riva, if you had any closing thoughts.
I just really appreciate being here. I think these issues affect every citizen, every taxpayer, every resident, every person who lives here, whether you're East Coast, West Coast, it does not matter. You will be touched by this. And I think it's a ongoing call to action and letting your elected officials know this doesn't serve the American people. And so that's just my thought on that.
On that note, folks should know that a recording of the event will be available at americanprogress.org/events, where you can register for all of CAP's upcoming events, including the other webinars in this specific series, and watch recordings of previous events. Thank you to the audience for attending, and a major thank you to Bobby Scopa, Riva Duncan, and Tom Sivak for participating and for the fruitful discussion and Q&A. As Riva said at the end, an ongoing call for action as it is still proposed and not actually enacted. So there's still time to influence any decision. Thank you again from all of us, and have a great rest of your Tuesday.